The emergency room doors burst open at Grayson Medical Center as Alex Rivera sprinted through the hallway, her M2 uniform still damp with rain and someone else's blood. The cardiac monitor in room 12 was flatlined, and she could hear Dr. Foster calling for immediate assistance. Without hesitation, Alex dove into the chaos, her hands moving with practiced precision as she began chest compressions on the unconscious teenager, who had been pulled from a car wreck just minutes earlier. The boy couldn't have been older than her brother Tommy, and something fierce and protective ignited in her chest as she worked to bring him back from the edge of death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The monitor beeped once, twice, then settled into a steady rhythm. Alex stepped back, breathing heavily, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail as she watched the medical team stabilize the patient. Dr. Foster caught her eye and nodded with approval, but Alex's attention was already shifting to the worried parents who had just arrived in the waiting room. She approached them with the kind of calm confidence that made people trust her instantly, explaining what had happened and what would happen next, her voice steady despite having just performed a miracle. This was who Alex Rivera was at her core, someone who ran toward danger when others ran away, someone who couldn't ignore suffering when she had the power to stop it. She had been born with an absence of the fear that paralyzed most people in crisis situations, a genetic gift that made her invaluable as a paramedic and incredibly dangerous to those who preferred to operate in shadows. Tonight, that fearless nature would be tested beyond anything she had ever imagined, and the stakes would be higher than any emergency room save. Alex finished her shift at 3 in the morning, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders like a heavy blanket as she changed out of her uniform in the staff locker room. The past 12 hours had been brutal, even by emergency medicine standards. 2 cardiac arrests, a multi-car accident on Highway 26, and a domestic violence case that had left her questioning humanity's capacity for cruelty. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the mirror, noting the new lines of fatigue around her brown eyes and the way her olive skin had taken on a grayish pallor from too many sleepless nights. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister Lily, who should have been asleep hours ago. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about what we talked about. Are you sure we're doing the right thing?" Alex sighed, knowing exactly what her 16-year-old sister was referring to. 3 weeks ago, Lily had witnessed something she shouldn't have seen while walking home from her job at the local coffee shop, something that had turned their quiet lives in Cascade City upside down, and forced Alex to make decisions no 25-year-old should have to make. The thing about being born without fear was that it made you uniquely qualified to see danger clearly, without the emotional fog that clouded most people's judgment. When Lily had come home that night, shaking and pale, describing the unmarked van and the teenage girls being forced inside against their will, Alex had known immediately that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple crime. The license plate Lily had memorized, the professional efficiency of the men involved, the way they had operated in broad daylight with complete confidence, these were the hallmarks of an organized operation with protection from above. Alex drove through the empty streets of Cascade City, her ancient Honda Civic struggling against the steep hills that characterized this part of Oregon. The city was beautiful in daylight, nestled between dense forests and the dramatic peaks of the Cascade Mountains, but at night it felt isolated and vulnerable. The population of 40,000 was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, which made it both a blessing and a curse when you were trying to protect someone from powerful people who preferred to operate in secrecy. She pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, a modest building called Millbrook, apartments that had been their home for the past 3 years since their parents had died in a climbing accident. Alex had been 22 then, suddenly responsible for raising her teenage sister and 12-year-old brother while finishing her MT certification and working 3 jobs to keep them afloat. The apartment was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms that she had converted into 3 by, turning the living room into her own space, sleeping on a pull-out couch so that Lily and Tommy could each have their privacy. The building was quiet as she climbed to the 3rd floor, her footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. She had chosen this place specifically because it had multiple exit routes, good sight lines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story of the surrounding area and neighbors who minded their own business. Living as the guardian of 2 minors had taught her to think defensively, to always have backup plans and emergency contacts. But lately that defensive thinking had taken on a more urgent edge. Alex unlocked the door to find Lily waiting for her in the small kitchen, still dressed in her school clothes despite the late hour. Her sister had inherited their mother's delicate features and their father's stubborn determination, a combination that made her both beautiful and dangerously principled. At 16, Lily was already showing signs of the fearless gene that ran in their family, though it manifested differently in her as a fierce sense of justice rather than Alex's instinctive protectiveness. "You look terrible," Lily said without preamble, pouring her sister a cup of coffee from the pot she had kept warm. "Thanks for the confidence boost," Alex replied, accepting the coffee gratefully and sinking into one of their mismatched kitchen chairs. "You should be sleeping. School tomorrow." "School seems pretty meaningless when we're talking about kids disappearing," Lily said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much too young. "I keep thinking about those girls, Alex. They looked so scared. What if we're the only people who know what happened to them?" Alex studied her sister's face, seeing the determination there that she recognized from looking in mirrors her whole life. This was the Rivera family curse and blessing. They couldn't turn away from suffering when they had the power to intervene. Their parents had been the same way, always volunteering for the most dangerous rescue missions in the mountains, always willing to risk their own safety to save strangers. It was what had made them heroes in their community and what had ultimately killed them when they had attempted to rescue a stranded climber during a severe storm. "We've been over this," Alex said carefully. "We went to the police. Detective Morrison took your statement. They're investigating." "Morrison is stalling," Lily said flatly. "I can tell. When I described the van and the men, something changed in his expression. He knows something he's not telling us." Alex couldn't argue with that assessment because she had noticed the same thing. Detective Morrison had been polite and professional during Lily's interview, but there had been subtle signs that made Alex's instincts scream warnings. The way he had avoided eye contact when discussing next steps, the speed with which he had dismissed Lily's description of the men as not detailed enough for identification, the fact that no follow-up investigation seemed to be happening despite the serious nature of the allegations. "Even if that's true," Alex said, "what do you expect us to do about it? We're not law enforcement. We don't have resources or authority or backup." "We have something better," Lily said, leaning forward with the intensity that made her such a formidable debater on her high school team. "We have Elena's files." The mention of Elena Vasquez sent a complicated mix of emotions through Alex's chest. Elena had been her partner during her first 2 years as an EMT, a veteran paramedic who had taught Alex everything she knew about emergency medicine and quite a bit about navigating the darker corners of human nature. More than that, Elena had become a mentor and surrogate older sister, someone who understood Alex's need to save everyone and helped her channel that impulse into effective action rather than reckless heroism. Elena had died 6 months ago in what had been ruled an accidental overdose found in her apartment with enough fentanyl in her system to kill 3 people. The official investigation had concluded that she had been struggling with prescription drug addiction following a back injury sustained on the job. But Alex had never believed that explanation. Elena had been clean for 5 years, attending regular Narcotics Anonymous meetings and serving as a sponsor for other recovering addicts. She had been passionate about exposing the pharmaceutical companies that had created the opioid crisis and had been working on some kind of investigation in her spare time. Before her death, Elena had given Alex a storage unit key and instructions to use everything inside if something happens to me. At the time, Alex had assumed Elena was just being paranoid, but the storage unit had contained files documenting connections between local officials and what appeared to be a sophisticated human trafficking operation. Elena had been building a case collecting evidence of corruption that went all the way to the state level, and she had apparently gotten too close to something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Elena's files are dangerous, Alex said quietly. If you're right about Morrison, then showing him what Elena found could put us all at risk. We're already at risk, Lily pointed out. If they figure out that I can identify the van and the men, they'll come for me anyway. At least with Elena's evidence, we have something to bargain with. Alex knew her sister was right, but the protective part of her recoiled from the idea of putting Lily in even more danger. She had spent the last 3 years building a safe, stable life for her siblings, working extra shifts to pay for Lily's college prep classes and Tommy's soccer league, making sure they had the normal childhood that circumstances had tried to steal from them. The thought of throwing all of that away to chase after criminals who had already killed Elena felt like betraying everything she had worked for. What about Tommy? Alex asked. If we do this, we can't protect him. He's 12 years old, Lily. He doesn't deserve to be dragged into this. He's already in it, Lily said sadly. When you become a target, your family becomes targets too. Elena told you that, didn't she? It's why she never got married, never had kids. She knew that the work she was doing put everyone she loved at risk. The accuracy of that observation hit Alex like a physical blow. Elena had indeed said something very similar during one of their late-night conversations after a particularly difficult call. She had talked about the isolation that came with knowing too much about how the world really worked, about the price of being someone who couldn't ignore injustice, even when ignoring it would be safer. Alex walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, checking for anything unusual. The habit had become automatic over the past few weeks, ever since Lily had come forward with her witness account. Their neighborhood was quiet and residential, filled with working families who minded their own business and appreciated the same courtesy from others. But lately, Alex had noticed small changes. Unfamiliar cars parked on their street for extended periods, the same jogger running past their building at unusual hours, a repair van that seemed to be working on infrastructure projects that never appeared to progress. Tell me about the van again, Alex said, still looking out the window. Every detail you can remember. Lily joined her at the window, and Alex could feel her sister's body temperature rise slightly with the adrenaline that came from revisiting traumatic memories. Dark blue or black, newer model, no windows in the back. Commercial license plates, but they were partially obscured by mud like it was intentional. 2 men in the front, both wearing baseball caps and sunglasses even though it was evening. The girls looked like they were around my age, maybe slightly older. They weren't fighting anymore by the time I saw them, which was somehow worse. What do you mean worse? They looked resigned, Lily said quietly. Like they had given up hope that anyone was going to help them. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. They weren't screaming or trying to escape because they had already learned that no one would come. Alex felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had driven her career choices and life decisions. The idea of teenage girls being systematically brutalized while the community remained oblivious or complicit triggered every instinct she had to fight back against cruelty and injustice. But she also understood that fighting back would require resources they didn't have, and skills that were outside her expertise as a paramedic. "Elena's files," she said finally. "Where exactly did she hide them?" Lily smiled for the first time in weeks, recognizing the shift in her sister's tone that meant Alex had made a decision. "Storage unit on the east side of town." "She gave you the key, remember? Unit 47. I remember. But if we're going to do this, we do it smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We gather the evidence, we find someone trustworthy to give it to, and then we disappear until it's safe to come back." Disappear where? Alex had been thinking about that question for weeks, ever since she had first realized that their situation might require an exit strategy. Elena mentioned a cabin once, up in the mountains near Cedar Valley, said it belonged to a friend who owed her a favor. Remote enough to stay hidden, but close enough to civilization that we could get help if we needed it. They spent the next hour planning their next moves with the kind of methodical precision that had kept their small family functional through years of uncertainty and loss. Alex would visit the storage unit during her next day off, using her medical credentials to rent a vehicle that would be less conspicuous than her distinctive Honda. Lily would maintain her normal school routine while documenting unusual activity around their apartment or her workplace. Tommy would be told that they were planning a surprise camping trip, which would explain any preparations they made for a potential quick departure. By the time they finished planning, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky outside their kitchen window. Alex felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and hypervigilance that came from staying awake too long while dealing with high-stress situations. She needed sleep, but she also needed to process what they had just committed to doing. They were essentially declaring war on an organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who threatened its operations. "Alex," Lily said as they prepared to try to get a few hours of sleep before the day began again, "do you ever wish you were different? More normal, I mean. The kind of person who could just call the police and trust that someone else would handle it?" Alex considered the question seriously, looking at her sister's face in the growing daylight. Lily was beautiful and brilliant, with her whole life ahead of her and endless possibilities for college and career and love. She deserved the chance to be a normal teenager worried about homework and boys and college applications, not someone forced to make life and death decisions about human trafficking rings and police corruption. "Sometimes," Alex admitted. "But then I think about those girls you saw, and about Elena, and about all the people who need someone to stand up for them when no one else will. Being normal would mean looking the other way, and I don't think I could live with myself if I did. That, even if it gets us killed, even then, some things are worth the risk." Lily nodded, understanding passing between them that went deeper than words. They were Rivera women, raised by parents who had taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Alex might have been born without the paralyzing fear that stopped most people from intervening in dangerous situations, but that didn't mean she was unaware of the risks they were taking. She simply valued other people's safety more than her own comfort, and she had raised her siblings to understand that some principles were worth defending regardless of the personal cost. As Alex finally settled onto her pull-out couch and tried to quiet her racing mind enough to sleep, she thought about Elena's last words to her. They had been leaving the hospital after a particularly difficult shift involving a young overdose victim, and Elena had seemed unusually reflective about the larger patterns they witnessed in their work. "You know what scares me most about this job," Elena had said as they walked to their vehicles in the parking garage. "It's not the blood or the violence or even the death. It's how easy it becomes to stop seeing the connections, to treat each emergency as an isolated incident instead of part of a larger system that's designed to destroy certain kinds of people." At the time, Alex had assumed Elena was talking about the drug epidemic or the cycle of poverty that sent the same families to the emergency room again and again. Now she understood that Elena had been talking about something much more specific and much more dangerous. She had been trying to map the connections between seemingly unrelated tragedies, and she had discovered that many of them weren't unrelated at all. Alex closed her eyes and tried to focus on her breathing, using the meditation techniques Elena had taught her for managing the stress of emergency medicine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions, but for now she needed to rest and gather her strength for whatever was coming. The fearless gene that had made her an effective paramedic was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined, and she would need every advantage she could find to protect the people she loved, while exposing the truth that Elena had died trying to reveal. Outside their apartment, Cascade City was waking up to another ordinary day, but Alex knew that their ordinary days were coming to an end. Soon they would be running for their lives, relying on skills and connections they had never expected to need, fighting against enemies who had every advantage except the one that mattered most. They might not have fear to hold them back, but they had love to drive them forward, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. Alex woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the coffee table beside her makeshift bed. The digital clock read 11:47 a.m., which meant she had managed exactly 4 hours of sleep before her body's natural alarm system kicked in. Years of working irregular shifts had trained her to function on minimal rest, but the stress of their situation was taking a toll that caffeine couldn't fix. She answered the phone without looking at the caller ID, expecting either the hospital calling her in for an emergency shift or one of her siblings needing something. Instead, she heard Detective Morrison's gravelly voice, and the tone immediately put her on high alert. "Ms. Rivera, I need you and your sister to come down to the station this afternoon. There have been some developments in the case, and we need to clarify a few details in Lily's statement." Alex sat up straighter, her mind instantly sharp despite the sleep deprivation. In her experience, police didn't call witnesses back for clarification unless something had gone wrong or someone was trying to build a case that didn't quite fit the available evidence. "What kind of developments?" "Nothing I can discuss over the phone. Can you be here by 2 o'clock? The request felt more like a demand, and Alex found herself automatically calculating exit strategies and defensive options. "Lily has school until 3:30. Can we make it 4 o'clock instead?" There was a pause that lasted just long enough to confirm Alex's suspicions that this wasn't routine follow-up. 4 o'clock works, and Ms. Rivera? Make sure she brings any documentation she might have related to what she witnessed. Photos, notes, anything that might help us move forward with the investigation. Alex ended the call with a growing sense of unease. Detective Morrison had been evasive during Lily's initial interview, but now he was actively asking for evidence that could potentially incriminate her sister if the wrong people gained access to it. She needed to think this through carefully, because once they walked into that police station, they would be committed to a course of action that might not have any safe exits. She called Lily's school and left a message that her sister had a medical appointment and would need to leave early. Then she spent 20 minutes researching Detective Morrison online, looking for any information that might explain his sudden change in approach. What she found was disturbing enough to make her consider abandoning their apartment immediately and heading for the mountains. Morrison had been with the Cascade City Police Department for 15 years, with a record that appeared exemplary on the surface. But when Alex dug deeper, using research skills Elena had taught her for investigating suspicious medical cases, she discovered a pattern of cases that had been quietly closed without resolution. Missing persons reports that had been downgraded to runaway cases, drug overdoses that had been ruled accidental despite evidence suggesting otherwise, domestic violence situations that had resulted in the victims withdrawing their complaints. After speaking with Morrison privately, more troubling was the timeline of Morrison's recent financial situation. Public records showed that he had purchased a new house in an expensive neighborhood 6 months ago, Around the same time, Elena had been building her case against the trafficking ring. His salary as a detective wouldn't have supported such a purchase without significant additional income, and there was no indication that he had inherited money or received any legitimate windfalls. Alex was still researching when Tommy came home from school, dropping his backpack by the door with the casual disregard for property that characterized 12-year-old boys everywhere. He was small for his age but athletic, with the kind of fearless energy that made him excellent at soccer and terrible at following safety instructions. Like his sisters, Tommy had inherited their family's tendency to rush toward danger rather than away from it, though in his case it usually manifested as climbing too high in trees or attempting skateboard tricks that were beyond his skill level. "Why do you look like someone stole your emergency kit?" Tommy asked, raiding the refrigerator for an after-school snack. "Did something happen at the hospital?" Alex realized that her expression must have reflected the anxiety she was feeling about their meeting with Morrison. She had become expert at hiding her concerns from her siblings, understanding that they looked to her for stability and reassurance in a world that had already taken too much from them. But the current situation was testing her ability to maintain that protective facade. "Just some complicated stuff with work," she said, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete picture. "How was school?" Tommy launched into a detailed account of a science project involving volcano models and a cafeteria food fight that had resulted in 3 students being sent to the principal's office. His enthusiasm for the mundane dramas of middle school life reminded Alex of everything they stood to lose if their investigation went wrong. Tommy deserved to worry about homework and friend drama, not police corruption and human trafficking rings. When Lily arrived home from school an hour later, Alex was ready with a plan that balanced caution with the need to move forward. They would meet with Morrison as requested, but they would bring backup in the form of Dr. Foster, who had agreed to accompany them as a character witness and medical professional. Elena had trusted Dr. Foster enough to share some of her concerns about patterns she was seeing in overdose cases, and Alex hoped that connection would provide some protection if the meeting went badly. "I don't like this," Lily said as they prepared to leave for the police station. Something about his voice on the phone sounded wrong. Wrong how? Like he was reading from a script, or like someone was coaching him on what to say. Alex had noticed the same thing, but hearing Lily articulate, it confirmed her instincts about the danger they were walking into. "We go in, we answer his questions honestly but carefully, and we don't volunteer any information about Elena's files. If he asks directly about other evidence, we tell him we need time to think about it. And if he tries to arrest me, then we lawyer up immediately, and you don't say another word until I can get you proper representation." They drove to the police station in Alex's Honda, taking a circuitous route that allowed her to check for surveillance. The downtown area of Cascade City was busy with afternoon traffic, providing good cover for their movements, but also making it difficult to spot potential threats. Alex had never thought of her hometown as a dangerous place before, but Elena's investigation had revealed networks of corruption and criminal activity that operated beneath the surface of normal community life. The Cascade City Police Department occupied a modern building that had been constructed with federal grants intended to improve law enforcement capabilities in rural areas. The architecture was meant to project authority and trustworthiness, with clean lines and plenty of glass that suggested transparency and accountability. But as Alex and Lily approached the main entrance, the building felt more like a fortress than a place where citizens came for help and protection. Dr. Foster was waiting for them in the lobby, her presence immediately calming some of Alex's anxiety. Amanda Foster was in her 50s, with graying brown hair and the kind of competent demeanor that made people trust her judgment in crisis situations. She had been Elena's friend as well as colleague, and she had been asking her own questions about the circumstances surrounding Elena's death. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Dr. Foster said quietly as they waited for Detective Morrison to collect them. "There are some things about Elena's case that never made sense medically. The amount of fentanyl in her system was inconsistent with recreational use, and there was no indication that she had been using any opioids leading up to her death." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if someone wanted to make a murder look like an accidental overdose, they would use exactly the method that killed Elena. Fast-acting, difficult to detect if you're not looking for it specifically, and easy to explain away given the current opioid crisis." Before Alex could respond, Detective Morrison appeared in the lobby. He was a large man in his 40s with the kind of presence that commanded respect in most situations, but felt vaguely threatening in their current circumstances. His handshake was firm but brief, and Alex noticed that he avoided making direct eye contact with any of them for more than a few seconds. "Ms. Rivera, Lily, thank you for coming in. Dr. Foster, I wasn't expecting you. I'm here as a friend of the family," Dr. Foster replied smoothly. "Elena Vasquez was a colleague of mine, and I know she cared deeply about Alex and her siblings. I wanted to make sure they have support during what I'm sure is a difficult process." Morrison's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of Elena's name, but he recovered quickly and led them to a small conference room rather than an interrogation room. The space was designed to be less intimidating than the formal interview rooms, with comfortable chairs and a round table that suggested collaboration rather than confrontation. But Alex noticed that Morrison positioned himself between them and the door, and there was a recording device on the table that he activated without asking for their consent. "Lily, I want to go over your statement from last week and see if you can remember any additional details that might help us identify the individuals involved in what you witnessed." For the next 30 minutes, Morrison walked Lily through her account of seeing the unmarked van and the teenage girls being forced inside. His questions were detailed and specific, focusing on elements that would be important for building criminal case, but Alex began to notice a pattern that concerned her. Morrison seemed less interested in identifying the perpetrators than in establishing exactly what Lily could and couldn't prove about what she had seen. "You mentioned that the license plate was partially obscured by mud," Morrison said, consulting his notes. "Did you get any letters or numbers that you could make out clearly?" "The first 3 letters were BKR," Lily replied confidently. "I remember because those are my friend Becca's initials." "And you're certain about that?" "Because we haven't been able to locate any vehicles matching that description with those license plate letters." Alex felt a chill run down her spine at the implication of Morrison's question. Either he was genuinely having trouble tracking down the van, which would suggest that the perpetrators had sophisticated resources for avoiding detection, or he was already knew exactly whose van it was and was trying to determine how much of a threat Lily's testimony posed to them. "I'm certain," Lily said firmly. "I wrote it down as soon as I got home because I knew it was important." "About that," Morrison said, his tone shifting slightly, "do you still have those notes? We'd like to include them in our evidence file." This was the moment Alex had been dreading, the point where they would have to decide how much trust to place in a system that seemed designed to protect the wrong people. Lily's notes contained more than just the license plate information. They included detailed descriptions of the men involved, the location where the incident had occurred, and her thoughts about why the scene had felt so wrong beyond just the obvious criminality. "She gave them to me for safekeeping," Alex interjected before Lily could respond. "I can provide copies, but I'd like to retain the originals until we understand more about where the investigation is heading." Morrison's expression hardened, and for the first time during the interview, he made direct eye contact with Alex. "Ms. Rivera, I need to remind you that withholding evidence in a criminal investigation is a serious offense. We're trying to help these girls who were taken, but we can't do that without full cooperation from witnesses." "Of course, Dr. Foster." said smoothly, intervening before the conversation could escalate into open conflict. "I'm sure Alex is just being cautious, which is understandable given her responsibility for her siblings. Perhaps we could arrange for the notes to be photocopied here at the station, so you have what you need for your investigation while the family retains their copies for their own records." The compromise was reasonable enough that Morrison couldn't object without seeming unnecessarily aggressive, but Alex could see that he was frustrated by their reluctance to simply hand over everything they had. She was beginning to understand that this interview wasn't really about gathering evidence to solve a crime. It was about assessing how much of a threat they posed to an operation that had powerful protection. "There's one more thing," Morrison said as the formal interview was winding down. "We've received information suggesting that Elena Vasquez may have been investigating similar incidents before her death. Did she ever discuss her work with any of you?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Alex felt her pulse rate spike as she realized that Morrison already knew about Elena's files. Either someone had told him about the storage unit, or he had been monitoring Elena's activities before her death and was now trying to determine how much information she had shared with others. "Elena was passionate about her work," Dr. Foster replied carefully. "She cared deeply about the communities we serve, and she often noticed patterns that others missed. But she was also professional enough to understand the boundaries of her role as a paramedic." "I'm not questioning her professionalism," Morrison said. "I'm trying to understand if she uncovered any information that might be relevant to our current investigation. Information that might help us understand the scope of what we're dealing with." Alex made a decision that would determine the direction of everything that followed. Elena did mention that she was concerned about some patterns she was seeing in overdose cases and missing persons reports. She thought there might be connections that weren't being investigated properly, but she never shared specific details with me about any ongoing investigation. The statement was carefully constructed to acknowledge that Elena had been investigating something without revealing the extent of Alex's knowledge about her findings. But she could see from Morrison's reaction that it wasn't enough to satisfy him. He needed to know exactly what Elena had discovered and who else might have access to that information. If Elena was conducting any kind of unofficial investigation, she may have put herself in danger, Morrison said, his tone taking on what might have been genuine concern. And if she shared that information with others, she may have put them in danger as well. "I'm trying to protect your family, Ms. Rivera, but I can't do that if you're not completely honest with me about what you know." It was a masterful manipulation, framing Morrison's need for information as concern for their safety while implying that their failure to cooperate fully would make them responsible for any harm that came to them. But Alex had heard similar tactics used by abusive partners who came through the emergency room, and she recognized the underlying threat beneath the protective language. "We appreciate your concern," she said, standing to indicate that the interview was over. "If we remember anything else that might be helpful, we'll contact you immediately." Morrison walked them to the lobby, maintaining his professional demeanor, but making no effort to hide his dissatisfaction with the outcome of the meeting. As they reached the main entrance, he caught Alex's arm gently but firmly, holding her back while Lily and Dr. Foster continued outside. "Ms. Rivera, I want to be very clear about something. The people involved in this operation are not the kind of criminals who respond to normal law enforcement pressure. They have resources, connections, and a willingness to eliminate threats. That puts your family in serious danger. If Elena left behind any evidence or information, the safest thing for everyone would be to turn it over to people who can handle it properly." Alex met his gaze steadily, drawing on the same inner calm that allowed her to function effectively during medical emergencies. If Elena had evidence of criminal activity, I'm sure she would have wanted it to reach the right people. The question is figuring out who the right people are. She left Morrison standing in the lobby and joined her sister and Dr. Foster outside the police station. knowing that they had just crossed a line that would make everything more dangerous but also more clear. Morrison wasn't trying to solve a crime, he was trying to contain one, and they had just made it obvious that they wouldn't be easily contained. "Well, that was illuminating," Dr. Foster said as they walked to their vehicles. "I think we can safely assume that Detective Morrison is not going to be our ally in this situation. What do we do now?" Lily asked, her voice steady despite the stress of the interrogation. Alex looked up at the mountains surrounding Cascade City, thinking about Elena's files and the cabin she had mentioned, and the choices that would determine whether her family survived the next few weeks. Now we get those files, and we find someone who can help us use them properly. But first, we need to assume that we're being watched and plan accordingly. They drove home separately, taking different routes and checking carefully for surveillance. Alex's mind was racing with tactical considerations and worst-case scenarios, but underneath the planning and preparation was a growing sense of clarity about their situation. They were committed now, whether they wanted to be or not. Morrison's interview had made it clear that staying quiet and hoping for the best wasn't an option. The people behind the trafficking ring already knew about Lily's testimony and Elena's investigation, and they were actively working to neutralize both threats. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Alex and Lily sat at their kitchen table with Elena's storage unit key between them. The small piece of metal represented their only advantage in a conflict where they were outmatched in every other way, but it also represented a point of no return. Once they accessed Elena's files, they would know too much to ever return to their normal lives. "Are you sure about this?" Alex asked her sister one final time. "I'm sure," Lily replied without hesitation. "Those girls in the van, Elena, whoever else is being hurt by these people, they deserve better than what they're getting from the system that's supposed to protect them. If we don't do this, who will?" Alex nodded, recognizing her own principles reflected in her sister's determination. Tomorrow they would retrieve Elena's evidence and begin the process of exposing the criminal organization that had operated with impunity for years. They would be walking into danger that neither of them was fully prepared for, but they would be walking into it together, with love and courage as their only weapons against enemies who had every other advantage. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical weather for late fall in Oregon, but somehow appropriate for the task ahead of them. Alex had called in sick to the hospital, something she rarely did, but which wouldn't raise suspicions given her generally reliable work record. She had also arranged for Tommy to spend the day with a friend's family, telling him they were planning a surprise for him that required him to be out of the apartment. The storage facility was located on the industrial side of town, a collection of beige metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing and security cameras. Alex parked their rental car, a gray sedan that looked like thousands of others, in a spot that provided good visibility of the entrance and exit routes. Facility appeared to be lightly staffed, with only one employee visible in the office and no security guards on the premises. Unit 47 was in the back corner of the facility, positioned where it would be difficult to observe from the main office or the street. Elena had chosen the location carefully, prioritizing privacy over convenience. Alex used the key Elena had given her, and the lock opened smoothly, revealing a small space packed with filing cabinets, boxes, and what appeared to be several hard drives and other electronic storage devices. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Elena had been documenting connections between dozens of individuals and organizations, mapping financial transactions, and collecting evidence of criminal activity that spanned multiple states. But as Alex and Lily began examining the files, a clear picture emerged of an operation that was both sophisticated and deeply integrated into the legitimate business and political structures of the region. The trafficking ring operated through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, a trucking company that provided transportation, a temp agency that supplied workers to various industries, and a chain of massage parlors that served as both recruitment centers and operational bases. But the real power behind the operation came from its connections to local law enforcement, state government officials, and federal agencies that were supposed to be investigating exactly this kind of criminal activity. Elena had documented payments flowing from the trafficking organization to bank accounts controlled by at least 6 police officers, including Detective Morrison. She had recorded conversations between city council members discussing how to handle problems related to the operation. She had photographed meetings between known criminals and respected community leaders who were supposed to be working to combat human trafficking. Most damning of all, Elena had obtained financial records showing that the trafficking ring had generated over $10 million in revenue during the past 3 years, with significant portions of that money being laundered through legitimate businesses and charitable organizations. The scope of the operation was far larger than anything Alex had imagined, involving hundreds of victims and potentially thousands of people who were either directly complicit or willfully ignorant of what was happening in their community. "This is why they killed her," Lily said quietly, examining a photograph that showed Detective Morrison accepting an envelope from a man Elena had identified as Marcus Webb, the operational leader of the trafficking ring. She wasn't just building a case, she was mapping their entire organization. Alex found herself staring at a detailed timeline Elena had constructed, showing the correlation between increased trafficking activity and the arrival of new law enforcement personnel, who were later discovered to have financial connections to the criminal organization. The pattern suggested that the corruption wasn't accidental or opportunistic. It was systematic and intentional, with the trafficking ring actively working to place their people in positions where they could control investigations and prosecutions. "We need to copy all of this and get it to someone who can act on it," Alex said, her medical training automatically shifting into triage mode as she assessed the overwhelming amount of evidence. "But we also need to assume that Elena's death means they know she was investigating them. They might not know exactly what she found, but they'll be watching for anyone who tries to continue her work." They spent the next 4 hours carefully photographing documents and copying electronic files onto encrypted drives, working with the systematic precision that their respective training had taught them. Alex's experience with medical documentation and Lily's computer skills from school combined to create an efficient process for preserving Elena's evidence while maintaining multiple backup copies. As they worked, Alex found herself thinking about Elena's final months and the courage it must have taken to continue investigating, even as the danger became more apparent. The files revealed that Elena had been receiving threatening messages for weeks before her death, warnings that escalated from anonymous phone calls to direct threats against her life. But she had continued documenting evidence and building her case, driven by the same protective instinct that now motivated Alex to continue her work. "Look at this," Lily said, holding up a folder marked with Elena's handwriting. "Plans for what to do if something happened to her." Inside the folder was a detailed instruction manual for exposing the trafficking ring, including contact information for federal agents who Elena believed were not compromised, journalists who specialized in investigating organized crime, and advocacy organizations that could provide protection for witnesses. Elena had also included legal documents that would transfer custody of her evidence to Alex in the event of her death, ensuring that her investigation could continue even if she was eliminated. The final item in the folder was a personal letter, addressed to Alex, sealed in an envelope marked, "Open only if you decide to continue my work." Alex's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and read Elena's final message to her. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means that the people I've been investigating have succeeded in silencing me. I hope it also means that you've found the courage to finish what I started. I know this isn't the life you planned for yourself or your family, but sometimes circumstances choose us rather than the other way around. The evidence in this storage unit represents years of work and the testimony of dozens of victims who trusted me with their stories. They deserve justice, and the girls who are still being trafficked deserve rescue. I can't ask you to risk your life for strangers, but I know you well enough to understand that you won't be able to live with yourself if you don't try. Be smart, be careful, and remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. You have everything you need to succeed. Trust your instincts, protect your family, and never forget that some things are worth any sacrifice. With love and faith in your strength, Alina. Alex folded the letter carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket, feeling the weight of Elena's trust and expectations settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She had inherited more than evidence and documentation. She had inherited a mission that would define the rest of her life, regardless of how long that life might be. "We need to leave," she said, checking her watch and realizing they had been in the storage unit longer than was safe. "And we need to assume that from now on, we're targets." They loaded the copied files into their rental car and drove away from the storage facility using a route that avoided main roads and traffic cameras. Alex's mind was already shifting into the tactical mode that had served her well during emergency medical situations, calculating risks and resources while preparing for multiple contingencies. The evidence they now possessed was powerful enough to destroy the trafficking ring and expose the corruption that protected it, but it was also dangerous enough to get them killed if they made any mistakes in how they used it. Elena had provided them with a roadmap for exposing the truth, but that roadmap would require them to trust people they had never met while evading enemies who had already proven their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. As they drove through the streets of Cascade City, Alex found herself seeing her hometown differently than she ever had before. Every police car was a potential threat, every government building a possible source of corruption, every business a potential front for criminal activity. Elena's investigation had revealed that the world was far more dangerous and morally complex than Alex had ever imagined, but it had also shown her that individual courage and determination could make a difference even against overwhelming odds. "What happens now?" Lily asked as they headed home to collect Tommy and begin the process of disappearing. "Now we become the people Elena trained us to be," Alex replied, feeling the fearless gene that had defined her entire life, crystallizing into a sense of purpose that transcended personal safety or comfort. "We save those girls, we expose the truth, and we make sure that Elena's sacrifice wasn't in vain." The safe house that Dr. Foster had arranged for them was a modest cabin about 30 miles outside Cascade City, hidden among dense pine forests that provided natural camouflage from aerial surveillance. Alex drove the winding mountain roads with practiced caution, checking her mirrors constantly for signs of pursuit, while Tommy peppered her with questions about their sudden camping trip. She had told him they were taking a few days to explore potential vacation spots, a story that explained their packed bags and the electronic equipment Lily was carefully monitoring for any signs that their phones were being tracked. Alex's EMT training had included basic tactical awareness, skills that were supposed to help her navigate dangerous emergency scenes, but she had never expected to use those abilities to protect her family from a criminal organization with law enforcement connections. Every vehicle behind them was a potential threat. Every checkpoint or construction zone, a possible trap. The mountain highways of Oregon were beautiful and remote, which made them ideal for both hiding and for disposing of people who knew too much about things they weren't supposed to know. The cabin belonged to a retired forest ranger named Jack Morrison, no relation to the detective despite the shared surname, who had worked with Dr. Foster during several search and rescue operations over the years. Jack was in his 70s but still sharp, with the kind of practical competence that came from decades of living in wilderness areas, where self-sufficiency wasn't a lifestyle choice but a survival necessity. He met them at the cabin's front, porch with a hunting rifle across his arm and a German shepherd at his side, both clearly intended to communicate that unexpected visitors wouldn't be welcome. "Amanda says you folks are having some trouble with bad people," Jack said, without preamble as Alex parked their rental car beside the cabin. "She also says you're the kind of good people worth helping. Round here, Amanda's word carries more weight than most government promises, so you're welcome to stay as long as you need." The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with 3 bedrooms and a main living area dominated by a stone fireplace that provided both warmth and a gathering place for planning their next moves. Jack had prepared the space for their arrival, stocking the refrigerator with enough food for several days and ensuring that the cabin's communication equipment was functional. There was no cell phone service in the immediate area, but Jack maintained a ham radio setup that could reach emergency services or trusted contacts throughout the region. "First rule of staying alive up here," Jack explained as he showed them around the property, "is understanding that you're completely on your own if trouble finds you. Nearest sheriff's deputy is 45 minutes away on a good day, assuming they're not already compromised by whoever you're running from. Second rule is that these mountains will hide you from damn near anything, but they'll also kill you if you're not prepared for them." Alex appreciated Jack's direct approach to their situation. Unlike the careful euphemisms and political considerations that had characterized their interactions with Detective Morrison, Jack's worldview was refreshingly clear about the realities of power and corruption. He had spent enough time dealing with federal agencies and local law enforcement to understand that badges and official positions didn't automatically confer trustworthiness or competence. Tommy was thrilled by the cabin's rustic amenities and the presence of Jack's dog, a patient animal named Scout, who seemed to understand that his primary job was keeping watch for threats while tolerating the enthusiasm of a 12-year-old who had never spent extended time in genuine wilderness. Lily was more focused on the practical aspects of their situation, helping Alex establish secure communication protocols and reviewing Elena's files to identify the most critical evidence for their next steps. That evening, as rain drummed against the cabin's metal roof and wind howled through the surrounding pines, Alex found herself studying the detailed organizational chart that Elena had constructed showing the connections between the trafficking ring and various legitimate institutions. The web of corruption was more extensive than anything she had imagined, reaching into city government, county law enforcement, state regulatory agencies, and even federal offices that were supposed to be investigating exactly this kind of criminal activity. Marcus Webb, the man Elena had identified as the operational leader of the trafficking ring, appeared to be a legitimate businessman on the surface, owning several companies that provided services to government agencies and nonprofit organizations. But Elena's investigation had revealed that these businesses were primarily fronts for money laundering and transportation logistics, moving both victims and profits through a network that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of complicit participants. The financial records Elena had obtained showed monthly payments flowing from Webb's organization to bank accounts controlled by law enforcement officers, city council members, and even federal agents who were supposed to be monitoring cross-border criminal activity. The amounts were significant enough to influence decision-making, but small enough to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, suggesting a level of sophistication that indicated professional criminal experience rather than opportunistic corruption. "Look at this timeline," Lily said, pointing to a document that Elena had created correlating trafficking activity with law enforcement personnel changes. Every time there was a new hiring wave in the police department or sheriff's office, trafficking incidents increased within 6 months. It's like they were specifically recruiting people who would either participate or look the other way. Alex studied the pattern Lily had identified, recognizing the systematic nature of the corruption that had allowed the trafficking ring to operate with such impunity. This wasn't a case of a few bad actors taking advantage of their positions for personal gain, It was evidence of a deliberate strategy to compromise law enforcement agencies by placing criminal operatives in positions where they could control investigations and prosecutions. The realization made their situation even more dangerous than Alex had initially understood. They weren't just dealing with criminals who had corrupted a few police officers. They were confronting an organization that had systematically infiltrated the institutions that were supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of criminal activity. Every contact with official law enforcement agencies could potentially alert the trafficking ring to their location and activities. Jack joined them at the dining table where they had spread Elena's files, bringing coffee and the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of dealing with dangerous situations in remote locations. "I've been thinking about what Amanda told me regarding your situation," he said, settling into a chair and studying the documents with obvious interest. This Elena woman, she was building more than just a criminal case. She was mapping a network. "What do you mean?" Alex asked, curious about Jack's perspective on their evidence. "During my time with the Forest Service, I dealt with illegal logging operations, drug cultivation, and human smuggling routes that all had one thing in common. They required extensive local knowledge and official protection to operate successfully. The people running those operations weren't outsiders who came in and set up shop. They were connected to the community, often for generations, with relationships that went back decades." Jack pointed to several names on Elena's organizational chart, individuals who held prominent positions in Cascade City's business and civic communities. These folks didn't just decide to become criminals for easy money. They were recruited, cultivated, and positioned over years to create a network that could control information flow and law enforcement response. What you're looking at is the result of a long-term strategy by people who understand how power really works in small communities. The implications of Jack's analysis were sobering. If the trafficking ring had been developing its network of corruption for years or even decades, then their influence would extend far beyond the obvious participants Elena had identified. There would be secondary connections, family relationships, business partnerships, and social obligations that created a web of complicity even among people who weren't directly involved in criminal activity. "So what do we do?" Lily asked, her voice steady despite the overwhelming nature of their opposition. "If they control local law enforcement and have connections to state and federal agencies, who can we trust?" Alex had been wrestling with the same question since they had left the storage facility. Elena's instructions had included contact information for federal agents and journalists who were supposed to be trustworthy, but there was no way to verify that information without potentially exposing themselves to people who might be compromised. The margin for error in choosing allies was essentially non-existent. One wrong decision could result in their deaths and the permanent burial of Elena's evidence. "We start with the journalists," Alex decided, pulling out the list Elena had compiled of investigative reporters who specialized in organized crime and government corruption. Media attention is something the trafficking ring can't control as easily as law enforcement investigations. If we can get the evidence to the right journalists, public exposure might provide enough protection for us to survive long enough to testify. Jack nodded approvingly at the strategy. Journalists have resources for protecting sources and publishing information even when official channels are compromised. But you'll need to be smart about initial contact. These people get approached by cranks and conspiracy theorists all the time, so you'll need to provide enough evidence upfront to prove you're legitimate without giving away everything you have. They spent the next several hours developing a communication strategy that balanced the need for security with the requirement to establish credibility with potential allies. Alex would make initial contact with 3 journalists from Elena's list, using encrypted communication protocols, and providing carefully selected evidence that demonstrated the scope of their information without revealing their location or identities. If any of the journalists responded positively and seemed genuinely committed to investigating the story, they would gradually provide additional evidence while maintaining operational security. The plan was risky, but necessary. Staying hidden in Jack's cabin indefinitely wasn't a viable option, especially with Tommy's schooling to consider and Alex's responsibilities at the hospital. They needed to move forward with exposing the trafficking ring while they still had the element of surprise, and before Marcus Webb's organization realized exactly what evidence Elena had collected and who now had access to it. That night, Alex lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest around the cabin, her mind racing with tactical considerations and worst-case scenarios. The fearless gene that had made her an effective paramedic was being tested in ways she had never anticipated, requiring her to make decisions that balanced calculated risks against potential catastrophic consequences. Every choice they made from this point forward would determine not only their own survival, but also the fate of the trafficking victims, who were counting on Elena's evidence to secure their freedom. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp mountain air that made Oregon's wilderness areas famous among outdoor enthusiasts. Alex woke early and found Jack already preparing breakfast, his movements efficient and purposeful in the way of people who had learned to maximize their productivity during daylight hours. Scout was positioned near the cabin's main window, alert but relaxed in the manner of a working dog who understood his responsibilities without needing constant direction. "Sleep any?" Jack asked, noting the dark circles under Alex's eyes that indicated another night of inadequate rest. "Some. Been thinking about next steps and trying to anticipate problems we haven't considered yet. Good habit in situations like this. Problem is, you can't anticipate everything, so you need to be ready to adapt when things go sideways." Alex appreciated Jack's straightforward approach to crisis management, which reminded her of Elena's teaching style during their EMP training. Both understood that complex, dangerous situations required flexible thinking rather than rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The trafficking ring had demonstrated sophisticated operational capabilities and extensive resources, which meant that any strategy for exposing them would need to account for aggressive countermeasures and attempts to eliminate threats. Lily and Tommy emerged from their shared bedroom as Jack was finishing breakfast preparations, both looking more rested than Alex felt, but clearly still processing the dramatic changes in their circumstances. Tommy remained enthusiastic about their wilderness adventure, but Lily's expression reflected the growing understanding that their situation was more serious and potentially long-lasting than they had initially realized. "I've been thinking about the journalist contacts," Lily said as they gathered around the dining table for breakfast. "Elena's list includes people from major newspapers and television networks, but it also has some independent journalists who might be more willing to take risks with controversial stories." Alex had reached the same conclusion during her sleepless night. Mainstream media organizations had resources and reach that could provide maximum exposure for Elena's evidence, but they also had corporate considerations and editorial policies that might limit their willingness to pursue stories that implicated law enforcement agencies and government officials. Independent journalists, particularly those who specialized in investigative work related to organized crime, might be more willing to take on powerful enemies but would have fewer resources for protecting sources and verifying information. "We try both approaches," Alex decided. "Start with independent journalists who can move quickly and aren't constrained by corporate legal departments, but also make contact with mainstream media as backup in case the independent outlets face pressure to kill the story." Jack's ham radio equipment allowed them to establish secure internet connectivity through a satellite uplink that was difficult to trace to their specific location. Alex spent the morning crafting carefully worded emails to 3 journalists from Elena's list, providing enough evidence to demonstrate the legitimacy of their claims while maintaining operational security. Each email included different pieces of evidence, so that if one journalist proved to be compromised, the others would still receive unique information that could advance the investigation. The first response came within hours from Sarah Kim, an independent journalist based in Portland who had built a reputation for exposing corruption in rural law enforcement agencies. Her reply was professionally skeptical but clearly interested, requesting additional documentation and proposing a secure communication protocol for ongoing information exchange. The second journalist, Michael Torres from a national newspaper, responded with standard language about editorial processes and verification requirements that suggested institutional caution rather than individual commitment. The third journalist, Rebecca Chun from an investigative television program, didn't respond at all, which could indicate either disinterest or the possibility that her communications were being monitored by the same people who had infiltrated law enforcement agencies. Alex made a note to avoid any further contact with Rebecca Chun while proceeding cautiously with the other two potential allies. Sarah Kim seems promising, Lily observed, reading over Alex's shoulder as she reviewed the journalist responses. Her questions are specific enough to suggest she understands the kind of evidence we're dealing with, and she's asking for exactly the type of documentation that Elena collected. Alex agreed with Lily's assessment, but remained cautious about trusting anyone completely until they had demonstrated genuine commitment to exposing the trafficking ring, regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. Elena's investigation had revealed that the corruption extended much further than anyone had initially realized, and there was no way to know how many seemingly legitimate institutions and individuals were compromised by criminal influence. That afternoon, while Alex worked on developing her relationship with Sarah Kim through encrypted communications, Lily focused on organizing Elena's evidence in a format that would be accessible to journalists and law enforcement agencies who weren't familiar with the case. The task required both technical skills for managing digital files and analytical abilities for identifying the most compelling evidence among thousands of documents and recordings. Tommy spent the day exploring the area around Jack's cabin under Scout's supervision, his 12-year-old energy seemingly unaffected by the stress and uncertainty that were wearing on his sisters. Alex envied her brother's ability to find joy and adventure in their circumstances, but she also understood that his innocence represented something precious that she was fighting to preserve. The world Elena's investigation had revealed was darker and more dangerous than any child should have to understand, and Alex was determined to shield Tommy from that knowledge for as long as possible. As evening approached, Jack returned from a scouting trip to the nearest town with supplies and information that confirmed Alex's worst fears about their situation. The trafficking ring's response to Elena's death and their family's subsequent investigation had been swift and comprehensive, with search teams already deploying throughout the region and rewards being offered for information about their whereabouts. "They're calling it a kidnapping investigation," Jack reported, his expression grim as he unloaded supplies from his truck. "Official story is that a dangerous fugitive has taken a family hostage and is moving through the mountain regions. Every law enforcement agency in 3 counties has your descriptions and vehicle information." The cover story was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. By framing Alex as a kidnapper rather than a whistleblower, the trafficking ring had ensured that anyone who encountered their family would see them as threats rather than victims. Local residents who might otherwise be sympathetic to people in trouble would instead report their location to authorities, and law enforcement officers who weren't directly compromised would still work to apprehend them based on false information about the nature of their situation. "How long before they expand the search area to include this region?" Alex asked, already knowing that their sanctuary at Jack's cabin was temporary at best. "Maybe a week if we're lucky. These mountains are big and there are lots of places to hide, but they have resources and technology that didn't exist when I was dealing with illegal operations up here. Thermal imaging, drone surveillance, cell phone tracking. If they're serious about finding you, they will. The timeline was shorter than Alex had hoped, but longer than she had feared. A week would be enough to establish solid communication with trustworthy journalists and begin the process of releasing Elena's evidence to the public. But it wouldn't be enough to complete a full investigation or ensure comprehensive prosecution of the trafficking ring's leadership. They would need to accelerate their plans while preparing for the possibility that they might have to run again before achieving their ultimate objectives. That night, as Alex worked late into the evening on secure communications with Sarah Kim and prepared digital evidence packages for public release, she found herself thinking about Elena's final letter and the weight of responsibility that came with continuing her mentor's work. The trafficking ring had operated with impunity for years, destroying countless lives while enriching themselves and their corrupt allies. Elena had died trying to stop them, and now Alex faced the choice between personal safety and the moral obligation to finish what Elena had started. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. Alex had been born without the paralyzing fear that stopped most people from confronting powerful enemies, and she had been raised by parents who had taught her that some principles were worth any sacrifice. The trafficking ring had made a fundamental error in targeting her family. They had assumed that terrorizing them would create compliance rather than resistance, but they had underestimated the Rivera family's capacity for turning protective love into relentless determination. "We're going to stop them," Alex said quietly to Lily as they finalized their communication strategy for the following day. "Not just expose them or slow them down, but completely destroy their operation and ensure that everyone involved faces justice. Even if it kills us, especially if it kills us. Because if we don't stop them, they'll keep destroying other families, and eventually they'll come for Tommy anyway." Lily nodded, understanding the logic that drove Alex's commitment to their dangerous mission. The trafficking ring's power came from operating in shadows and silence, using fear and corruption to prevent exposure and accountability. But Elena's evidence, combined with Alex's fearless determination to use it effectively, represented a threat that could bring down their entire network if properly deployed against their vulnerabilities. The next few days would determine whether Elena's sacrifice had been meaningful or merely tragic, whether Alex's family would survive their confrontation with institutional corruption, and whether the trafficking victims who were counting on them would finally receive the justice and freedom they deserved. Alex had never faced higher stakes or more dangerous enemies, but she had also never been more certain that she was fighting for something worth any risk. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. when Alex was monitoring encrypted communications on Jack's ham radio equipment, listening for any indication that their location had been compromised. Instead, she intercepted a conversation between Marcus Webb and someone identified only as the senator, discussing contingency plans for dealing with what they called the Elena situation. The conversation was brief but revealing, confirming that Webb's organization had indeed killed Elena and was now actively hunting for anyone who might have access to her evidence. More importantly, the intercepted communication revealed the location of what Webb referred to as the primary facility, a warehouse complex near the Columbia River that served as the trafficking ring's main operational headquarters. Alex's hands trembled as she recorded the conversation and cross-referenced the location with Elena's files, finding multiple references to the same address in connection with transportation logistics and victim processing activities. The warehouse complex was heavily guarded and monitored, but Elena's investigation had identified several vulnerabilities in the facility's security systems. More critically, she had documented the regular schedule of victim transportation that moved dozens of trafficked individuals through the facility each week. If Alex could coordinate the release of Elena's evidence with law enforcement raids on the facility during peak operational periods, they could potentially rescue victims, while simultaneously providing irrefutable proof of the trafficking ring's activities. Sarah Kim had proven to be exactly the kind of ally they needed, demonstrating both professional competence and personal courage in her willingness to pursue the story despite obvious risks to her own safety. Her initial investigation had confirmed key elements of Elena's evidence while uncovering additional information about the trafficking ring's political connections. Sarah had also established contact with federal agents who specialized in organized crime investigations, individuals who were based outside the Pacific Northwest, and therefore less likely to be compromised by local corruption. The timing has to be perfect, Alex explained to Lily and Jack as they finalized their plan for exposing the trafficking ring. Sarah publishes her initial story at exactly the same moment that federal agents raid the warehouse facility. The media attention will make it impossible for corrupt local officials to cover up or minimize what's found during the raid. Jack nodded approvingly at the coordination required for their strategy. You'll need communication redundancy and multiple backup plans, because Webb's people will try to disrupt anything that threatens their operation. They've got resources and experience that you don't, so you'll need to be smarter and more prepared than they expect. The plan they developed was complex, but necessarily so, given the sophistication of their opponents and the stakes involved. Alex would personally deliver the most critical evidence to Sarah Kim in Portland, while Lily coordinated with federal agents through secure communication channels. Jack would monitor law enforcement radio frequencies for any indication that their activities had been detected, ready to provide early warning if they needed to abort the operation. Tommy would remain at the cabin with Scout, protected by Jack's presence and the remote location's natural defenses. Alex hated leaving her youngest brother behind, but the risks involved in their final confrontation with the trafficking ring were too great to expose him to unnecessary danger. If their plan succeeded, Tommy would be reunited with his sisters within days. If it failed, Jack had instructions for getting Tommy to safety and ensuring his long-term care. The drive to Portland required Alex to navigate through multiple law enforcement checkpoints that had been established as part of the supposed kidnapping investigation. Her EMT credentials and the medical emergency kit in her vehicle provided plausible explanations for her presence on mountain highways, and her natural calm under pressure allowed her to interact with suspicious officers without revealing the anxiety she felt about their mission's success. Sarah Kim had arranged to meet Alex at a small coffee shop in southeast Portland, a location that provided good visibility of potential surveillance while maintaining enough foot traffic to blend in with normal urban activity. The journalist was younger than Alex had expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of focused intensity that characterized people who had found their calling in dangerous work. Sarah's questions were precise and professional, demonstrating that she had already begun verifying Elena's evidence through independent sources. "I've confirmed the financial transactions you provided," Sarah said quietly, reviewing documents on her laptop while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. The money trail leads exactly where Elena thought it would, connecting Webb's organization to bank accounts controlled by local officials and law enforcement personnel. I've also verified the identities of several trafficking victims through immigration records and missing persons reports. The validation of Elena's work was both satisfying and sobering. Elena had died before seeing her investigation vindicated, but her methodical documentation and careful analysis had created an unshakable foundation for exposing the trafficking ring's operations. Sarah's independent verification meant that the evidence would withstand legal challenges and media scrutiny, providing the credibility necessary for generating public outrage and official action. "The federal agents I've been working with are ready to move on the warehouse facility," Sarah continued. "They've been building their own case against Webb's organization for months, but they needed local evidence and victim testimony to justify a major operation. Elena's files provide exactly what they were missing." Alex felt a surge of satisfaction at learning that Elena's investigation was the missing piece that would finally bring down the trafficking ring. The federal agents had resources and authority that local law enforcement couldn't match, and their distance from Pacific Northwest corruption networks meant they could act without worrying about internal leaks or political interference. The coordination meeting lasted 2 hours, with Alex and Sarah refining their timeline and establishing backup communication protocols for the critical 24-hour period when everything would happen simultaneously. Sarah would publish her expose at precisely 6 o'clock the following morning, timed to coincide with the federal raid on Webb's warehouse facility. The morning timing would ensure maximum media coverage, while catching the trafficking ring during their peak operational period. As Alex prepared to return to the mountains, Sarah handed her a secure phone that would allow real-time communication during the operation. "Elena was right about you," Sarah said with obvious respect. "She told me in her last message that if anything happened to her, Alex Rivera would be the one person who could finish what she started. She said you had the courage to walk into any danger for people you loved." The drive back to Jack's cabin took Alex through increasingly familiar mountain terrain, but she noticed details that had escaped her attention during previous trips. The isolation that provided their sanctuary also created vulnerabilities that sophisticated enemies could exploit. If Webb's organization had identified their general location, the winding mountain roads offered limited escape routes and multiple opportunities for ambush or containment. Alex's tactical awareness had been sharpened by days of living under threat, transforming her medical training into a broader understanding of crisis management and survival strategy. She checked her mirrors constantly, varied her speed and route selection, and maintained mental notes about potential hiding places or defensive positions. The fearless gene that had made her an effective paramedic was evolving into something more comprehensive and dangerous. Lily was waiting at the cabin, with updates from her communication with federal agents and disturbing news about the expanding search for their family. Webb's organization had increased the reward for information about their whereabouts, while spreading false stories about Alex's supposed mental instability and history of violence. The disinformation campaign was designed to ensure that anyone who encountered them would see Alex as dangerous rather than sympathetic. "They're getting desperate," Lily observed, showing Alex the latest alerts being circulated by local law enforcement. "Which means our plan is working, but it also means they'll take bigger risks to stop us." Jack confirmed Lily's assessment with intelligence he had gathered from his contacts in the local community. Webb's people were asking questions and offering money for information, but they were also making threats against anyone who might be harboring fugitives. The combination of incentives and intimidation was effective in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. "We've got maybe 18 hours before they narrow the search enough to find this place," Jack estimated. "After that, you'll need to be gone or ready to fight, because they won't be interested in taking prisoners." The timeline was tight, but manageable if everything went according to plan. Alex would maintain communication with Sarah Kim through the night, monitoring the progress of final preparations for the coordinated exposure operation. Federal agents were already positioning themselves around Webb's warehouse facility, using surveillance equipment to document the trafficking rings activities while preparing for the dawn raid. Tommy seemed to sense the increased tension around the cabin, asking more questions about their situation and expressing concern about when they would be able to return to their normal lives. Alex found herself struggling to provide reassuring answers while being honest about the uncertainties they faced. The trafficking ring's response to their investigation had demonstrated that there might not be any return to their previous existence, regardless of how successful their mission proved to be. "Are we going to be okay?" Tommy asked as Alex tucked him into bed, his 12-year-old directness cutting through the careful euphemisms that adults use to avoid confronting difficult realities. "We're going to be different," Alex replied. "Honestly. But we're going to be together, and we're going to be proud of what we've done to help people who couldn't help themselves." The night passed slowly, with Alex maintaining constant communication with Sarah Kim, while monitoring law enforcement frequencies for any indication that their operation had been compromised. Federal agents reported normal activity at the warehouse facility, with several vehicles arriving and departing according to the schedule Elena had documented in her files. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, but Alex's experience with emergency medicine had taught her that successful outcomes often depended on managing complications that couldn't be anticipated. Dawn arrived gray and misty, typical weather for Oregon's mountain regions, but ideal cover for the federal operation against Webb's warehouse facility. Alex listened to encrypted radio communications as federal agents moved into position around the complex, their professional coordination evident in the crisp efficiency of their tactical communications. Sarah Kim confirmed that her story was ready for publication, with all necessary legal reviews completed and editorial approval secured. At exactly 6 o'clock, Sarah's expose appeared simultaneously on multiple media platforms, revealing the full scope of Webb's trafficking operation along with documented evidence of the corruption that had protected it. The story included photographs, financial records, victim testimonies, and law enforcement communications that Elena had collected over months of dangerous investigation. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, making it impossible for officials to dismiss the allegations as unfounded conspiracy theories. The federal raid began precisely as Sarah's story went live, with heavily armed agents surrounding the warehouse complex and cutting off all escape routes. Alex monitored the operation through encrypted communications, listening as agents breached the facility and began documenting what they found inside. The discovery of dozens of trafficking victims, along with extensive evidence of financial crimes and official corruption, validated everything Elena had died trying to expose. Within hours, arrest warrants were issued for Marcus Webb and 17 other individuals identified in Elena's files as key participants in the trafficking operation. The speed and scope of the law enforcement response demonstrated the federal government's commitment to dismantling the entire network rather than simply prosecuting a few visible participants. Webb's political connections and law enforcement allies found themselves under investigation rather than in positions to provide protection. Detective Morrison was arrested at his home, along with 3 other Cascade City police officers who had been receiving payments from Webb's organization. The arrest warrants were executed simultaneously to prevent suspects from fleeing or destroying evidence, a coordination that would have been impossible without Elena's detailed documentation of the corruption network. "It's working," Lily said. Monitoring news coverage of the raids and arrests on Jack's computer. "The story is spreading faster than they can contain it, and federal agents are finding everything Elena predicted they would find." Alex felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and grief as she watched Elena's investigation finally achieve its intended impact. The trafficking ring that had operated with impunity for years was being systematically dismantled, but Elena wasn't alive to see the justice she had fought so hard to achieve. The victims being rescued from Webb's facility owed their freedom to a woman they would never meet, whose courage and determination had continued working even after her death. The manhunt for Alex's family officially ended that afternoon when federal prosecutors announced that the Rivera family were witnesses under federal protection rather than fugitives from justice. The revelation that Alex and Lily had been instrumental in exposing the trafficking ring transformed them from wanted criminals into public heroes, though Alex knew the reality was more complicated than the media narrative suggested. Webb himself was arrested attempting to flee the country, captured at a private airfield where he had expected to board a jet that would take him to a non-extradition country. Elena's files had included details about his escape plans, allowing federal agents to anticipate his movements and cut off his retreat routes. The arrest was particularly satisfying because it demonstrated that Webb's extensive resources and criminal experience were ultimately no match for Elena's methodical investigation and Alex's determination to see it through to completion. Tommy's reaction to learning the truth about their situation was characteristic of his resilient personality and strong family loyalty. Rather than being traumatized by the revelation that they had been fighting dangerous criminals, he was proud of his sister's courage and determined to help however he could. His response reminded Alex that protecting people sometimes meant trusting them with difficult truths rather than shielding them from reality. The legal proceedings that followed would take months to complete, with Alex and Lily serving as key witnesses in prosecutions that would ultimately result in dozens of convictions and life sentences for trafficking ring leadership. But the immediate impact of their investigation was the rescue of over 200 victims from various facilities controlled by Webb's organization, along with the identification of hundreds more who had been trafficked through the network over its years of operation. Sarah Kim's reporting on the trafficking ring earned her a Pulitzer Prize and established her as one of the country's leading investigative journalists specializing in organized crime. She remained in contact with Alex's family, documenting their transition back to normal life while continuing to investigate similar operations in other regions. Sarah's work demonstrated that Elena's investigation was part of a much larger pattern of trafficking and corruption that extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Foster offered Alex a position, with a new task force being established to identify and investigate medical cases that might indicate trafficking or other forms of organized crime. The work would allow Alex to use her emergency medical skills while continuing Elena's mission of protecting vulnerable populations from predatory criminal organizations. The position also provided the kind of stable income and professional respect that would allow Alex to support her siblings while pursuing justice for victims who couldn't advocate for themselves. Lily decided to pursue journalism as her college major, inspired by Sarah Kim's example and determined to continue fighting against corruption and injustice through investigative reporting. Her experience with Elena's investigation had given her practical skills in research and analysis that would serve her well in academic settings and professional newsrooms. Lily's natural intelligence and fearless determination made her ideally suited for the challenging work of exposing powerful people who preferred to operate in secrecy. The Rivera family returned to Cascade City 6 months after Webb's arrest, moving into a new home in a different neighborhood, while maintaining security precautions that had become second nature during their time as targets. The city itself was transformed by the exposure of corruption within its government and law enforcement agencies, with federal oversight ensuring that new leadership was committed to transparency and accountability. Alex found herself frequently visiting Elena's grave, updating her mentor on the progress of prosecutions and the ongoing rescue of trafficking victims. The cemetery was peaceful and private, providing space for reflection on the costs and consequences of their successful mission. Elena's sacrifice had saved hundreds of lives and exposed a criminal network that might otherwise have operated indefinitely, but Alex still grieved for the woman who had taught her that courage meant acting despite fear rather than acting without it. The trafficking ring's financial assets, seized during the federal investigation, were used to establish a victim services foundation that provided counseling, housing, and legal assistance to people who had been rescued from various forms of modern slavery. Alex served on the foundation's board, using her medical background and investigative experience to help develop programs that addressed the complex trauma that trafficking victims experienced. Tommy thrived in their new circumstances, making friends easily and excelling in school while maintaining the athletic interests that had always been important to him. His resilience and optimism reminded Alex daily of what they had been fighting to protect and why Elena's mission had been worth the risks they had faced together. Tommy's ability to find joy and purpose despite their family's traumatic experiences demonstrated the power of love and courage to overcome even the most determined enemies. The fearless gene that had defined Alex's approach to emergency medicine evolved into a broader commitment to social justice and victim advocacy. She understood now that her natural lack of paralyzing fear was a gift that carried responsibilities extending far beyond individual medical emergencies. There were systems of oppression and exploitation that required people willing to confront powerful enemies, and Alex had discovered that she was uniquely equipped for exactly that kind of dangerous work. Years later, when Alex was invited to speak at conferences about human trafficking and organized crime investigation, she always began her presentations with a tribute to Elena Vasquez, the mentor who had taught her that some things were worth any sacrifice. Elena's courage and determination lived on through the lives she had saved and the criminal network she had exposed, proving that individual actions could create changes that extended far beyond personal circumstances. The warehouse that had served as Webb's primary facility was converted into a training center for law enforcement personnel, teaching officers how to identify and investigate trafficking operations while avoiding the corruption that had protected such crimes in the past. The irony of using Webb's former headquarters to train the people who would prevent similar operations was not lost on Alex, who saw it as a fitting monument to Elena's memory and the victims she had died trying to save. Tommy often asked Alex to tell him stories about Elena and their investigation of the trafficking ring, particularly the parts where his sisters had demonstrated the kind of courage that he hoped to develop in his own life. Alex was careful to emphasize the collaborative nature of their success, explaining that Elena's investigation had succeeded because it combined careful research with determination to act on dangerous knowledge despite personal risks. The Rivera family story became part of the training curriculum at police academies and social work programs throughout the country, illustrating how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when they refused to ignore injustice and corruption. Alex took pride in knowing that their experience was inspiring other people to act courageously when confronted with evidence of systematic wrongdoing. Lily's journalism career flourished as she developed expertise in investigating organized crime and government corruption, following the path that Elena had pioneered and Sarah Kim had continued. Her work led to the exposure of several additional trafficking networks and corrupt officials, demonstrating that the patterns Elena had identified in the Pacific Northwest existed in communities throughout the country. The bond between Alex and Lily deepened through their shared experience of confronting powerful enemies and succeeding against overwhelming odds. They had learned to trust each other completely and to coordinate their different skills in service of protecting vulnerable people from predatory criminals. Their partnership became a model for how family loyalty could be channeled into effective social advocacy. Dr. Foster remained close to the Rivera family, serving as both professional mentor and surrogate family member. Her willingness to support their investigation, despite personal and professional risks, had been crucial to their success, and her continued friendship provided stability and guidance as they adapted to their new roles as public figures and advocates for justice. Jack Morrison's cabin remained available as a retreat when the pressures of public life became overwhelming, offering the peace and perspective that could only be found in wilderness settings far from urban complexity. The cabin represented both sanctuary and preparation, a place where the Rivera family could rest while planning their next efforts to identify and combat organized crime operations. The federal task force that Alex joined expanded into a national network of medical professionals trained to recognize signs of trafficking and other forms of criminal exploitation. The program's success demonstrated that Elena's vision of using medical settings to identify and rescue victims could be scaled up to protect vulnerable populations throughout the country. 5 years had passed since the warehouse raids that brought down Marcus Webb's trafficking empire, And Alex Rivera stood before the newest graduating class of the Pacific Northwest Anti-Trafficking Academy, looking out at 47 law enforcement officers, social workers, and medical professionals who had just completed the most comprehensive training program of its kind in the country. The academy occupied the renovated building that had once housed Webb's criminal operations, its transformation from a site of exploitation into a center for justice, serving as a powerful symbol of how determined individuals could reshape even the darkest legacies. Alex's role as the Academy's director had evolved naturally from her work with the federal task force, as prosecutors and investigators recognized that her unique combination of medical expertise, investigative experience, and fearless commitment to victim advocacy made her ideally suited to train others in identifying and combating human trafficking operations. The position allowed her to honor Elena's memory while multiplying the impact of their original investigation through the hundreds of professionals who graduated from the Academy's programs each year. The graduation ceremony was held in the Academy's main auditorium, a space that Elena would have found almost unimaginable during her lonely months of building evidence against what seemed like an untouchable criminal network. The walls displayed photographs of the victims who had been rescued through investigations conducted by Academy graduates, along with maps showing the global reach of trafficking operations that had been disrupted by the techniques and strategies developed through Elena's pioneering work. Lily had returned from her assignment in Eastern Europe just in time for the graduation ceremony, her work as an investigative journalist having taken her to some of the world's most dangerous places in pursuit of stories about international trafficking networks and government corruption. At 21, she had already won several prestigious journalism awards for her reporting on criminal organizations that operated across national boundaries, and her fearless approach to dangerous assignments had established her as one of the most respected investigative reporters of her generation. Tommy, now 17 and preparing for his senior year of high school, had grown into the kind of young man that Alex had always hoped he would become. His natural athletic ability had earned him scholarship offers from several universities, but his real passion lay in the social justice work that had become central to his family's identity. Tommy spent his summers working with the Victim Services Foundation, providing support and companionship to young people who were rebuilding their lives after escaping various forms of exploitation and abuse. Dr. Foster remained closely involved, with the Academy as its chief medical advisor, developing protocols that helped healthcare workers recognize signs of trafficking and other forms of systematic abuse. Her research on the medical consequences of long-term exploitation had become required reading in medical schools throughout the country, and her advocacy for trauma-informed care had influenced treatment approaches in hospitals and clinics around the world. The transformation of Cascade City itself had been equally dramatic, with federal oversight ensuring that the corruption exposed by Elena's investigation could never again take root in local institutions. The new police chief, recruited from outside the region specifically to avoid any connections to Webb's network, had implemented transparency measures and community accountability programs that served as models for other jurisdictions dealing with similar challenges. Sarah Kim had used her Pulitzer Prize recognition to establish a nonprofit investigative journalism organization focused specifically on exposing human trafficking and organized crime operations. Her team of reporters worked closely with law enforcement agencies and advocacy organizations to ensure that their investigations led to concrete action rather than simply generating public awareness. Sarah's organization had become the premier source of investigative reporting on trafficking issues, with their stories regularly leading to arrests, prosecutions, and policy changes at the highest levels of government. The financial impact of Elena's investigation continued to reverberate through criminal networks years after Webb's arrest, as federal agents used the intelligence gathered from his organization to identify and dismantle related operations throughout North America and internationally. The coordination between different law enforcement agencies that had been pioneered during the web investigation became the standard approach for combating transnational organized crime, with Elena's methodical documentation serving as the template for building comprehensive cases against sophisticated criminal enterprises. Jack Morrison had become something of a legend among the Academy's students and staff, regularly invited to share his perspectives on survival and resistance in hostile environments. His mountain cabin remained available as a training facility for Academy programs that focused on remote operations and wilderness survival skills, teaching students how to maintain operational security while conducting dangerous investigations in isolated areas. The Victim Services Foundation that had been established with web-seized assets had grown into one of the most effective organizations of its kind, providing comprehensive support services to thousands of trafficking survivors while advocating for policy changes that addressed the root causes of exploitation and abuse. Alex served on the Foundation's board of directors, using her position to ensure that the voices of survivors remained central to all decisions about programs and priorities. The international impact of Elena's investigation had been perhaps the most surprising development, as foreign governments and international organizations recognized the effectiveness of the investigative techniques and victim identification protocols that had been developed through her work. The Academy's training programs attracted students from dozens of countries, creating a global network of professionals who shared information and coordinated efforts to combat trafficking operations that crossed national boundaries. Tommy's high school thesis project focused on the psychological factors that enabled ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of courage in the face of overwhelming opposition, using his family's experience as a case study while interviewing other individuals who had taken significant personal risks to protect vulnerable populations. His research demonstrated the academic depth and analytical sophistication that would serve him well in his planned career combining law enforcement with social justice advocacy. Lily's latest investigation had taken her deep into the networks that supplied victims to trafficking operations, revealing how economic desperation and political instability in various regions created conditions that criminal organizations exploited to maintain steady supplies of vulnerable people. Her reporting had led to increased international cooperation in addressing the economic and social factors that made communities susceptible to trafficking recruitment, demonstrating how investigative journalism could influence policy at the highest levels of government. The anniversary of Elena's death had become an annual day of remembrance at the Academy, with students and staff gathering to hear stories about the woman whose courage and determination had made their work possible. Alex always spoke at these memorial services, sharing details about Elena's investigation while emphasizing the collaborative nature of their success and the ongoing need for individuals willing to confront powerful enemies of justice and human dignity. The cascade effect of Elena's investigation continued to generate new revelations and prosecutions, years after the original case had been closed, as victims gained the confidence to come forward with additional information and law enforcement agencies developed better techniques for following complex financial trails. Each new arrest and prosecution validated Elena's belief that systematic documentation and careful analysis could ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal operations. Alex's own transformation from emergency medical technician to international advocate for trafficking victims had required her to develop skills and perspectives that she never could have imagined needing during her early career. The fearless gene that had made her effective in medical emergencies proved equally valuable in confronting criminal organizations and corrupt officials, though the stakes and consequences of her work had expanded far beyond anything she had experienced in hospital settings. The Academy's research division had identified patterns in trafficking operations that suggested the existence of much larger criminal networks than anyone had previously suspected, with Webb's organization representing just one component of international systems that generated billions of dollars in revenue while destroying millions of lives. This recognition had led to increased funding and resources for anti-trafficking efforts, along with greater coordination between agencies that had previously worked in isolation. Tommy's college applications reflected his commitment to continuing his family's work in social justice and victim advocacy, with essays that demonstrated both intellectual sophistication and personal passion for protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. His acceptances to several prestigious universities represented not just individual achievement, but also recognition of the valuable perspectives he would bring to academic and professional communities. Lily's engagement to a fellow investigative journalist who specialized in international organized crime had been announced at the Academy's annual fundraising gala, with the couple's shared commitment to dangerous work serving as an inspiration to other young professionals who were choosing careers that prioritize social impact over personal safety or financial gain. Their partnership represented the kind of collaborative relationship that Elena had envisioned between people who shared commitment to justice and human dignity. Dr. Foster's retirement from active medical practice had allowed her to focus entirely on her work with the Academy and Victim Services Foundation, developing training programs that helped healthcare workers recognize and respond appropriately to evidence of trafficking and other forms of systematic abuse. Her influence on medical education ensured that future generations of healthcare professionals would be better prepared to identify and assist victims who might otherwise remain invisible to systems that were supposed to protect them. The global network of Academy graduates had begun developing their own training programs and investigative techniques, adapted to the specific challenges and opportunities present in their home countries and regions. This expansion of Elena's original methodology demonstrated how individual courage and determination could create institutional changes that extended far beyond the circumstances that had originally motivated action. Alex's speaking engagements at international conferences and policy forums had established her as one of the world's leading experts on community-based approaches to combating human trafficking, with her presentations regularly influencing government policies and law enforcement strategies. Her emphasis on the importance of individual courage and community responsibility resonated with audiences who were looking for practical approaches to seemingly overwhelming social problems. The anniversary edition of Sarah Kim's original expose about Webb's trafficking operation had become required reading in journalism schools and law enforcement academies, demonstrating how investigative reporting could be combined with law enforcement operations to achieve maximum impact against criminal organizations. Sarah's techniques for protecting sources while building compelling narratives had influenced a generation of investigative journalists who were pursuing similar stories in their own communities. Tommy's graduation from high school was marked by a ceremony at the Academy, with Elena's photograph prominently displayed alongside images of the hundreds of victims whose lives had been transformed through the work that began with her investigation. The symbolism of the next generation stepping forward to continue the fight against trafficking and exploitation provided hope that the progress achieved through Elena's sacrifice would continue expanding into the future. The establishment of Elena Vasquez scholarships at universities throughout the region ensured that students from backgrounds similar to Elena's would have opportunities to pursue careers in law enforcement, journalism, social work, and other fields that were essential for protecting vulnerable populations. The scholarship recipients were required to commit to spending at least 2 years working in anti-trafficking efforts, creating a pipeline of talented professionals who shared Elena's commitment to justice and human dignity. Lily's first book, a comprehensive examination of international trafficking networks based on her years of investigative reporting, had become a bestseller while also serving as a practical guide for law enforcement agencies and advocacy organizations. The book's success demonstrated public appetite for understanding complex criminal operations while providing detailed information that could be used by professionals working to combat similar organizations. Alex's decision to pursue advanced degrees in criminology and public administration reflected her commitment to expanding her effectiveness as an advocate and administrator, while also providing academic credentials that enhanced her credibility when testifying before legislative committees and international forums. Her research focused on the intersection of healthcare and criminal justice systems, exploring how medical professionals could be better integrated into efforts to identify and assist trafficking victims. The construction of a permanent memorial to Elena and other individuals who had died fighting trafficking operations was completed in the Academy's courtyard, providing a space for reflection and remembrance that honored their sacrifice, while inspiring future generations of advocates and investigators. The memorial's design incorporated elements that represented hope and renewal alongside recognition of loss, emphasizing that the work of protecting vulnerable populations required both mourning for those who had been lost and commitment to continuing their mission. Tommy's acceptance to his first-choice university, along with his selection as a recipient of one of the Elena Vasquez scholarships, represented both personal achievement and symbolic continuity between Elena's original investigation and the ongoing work of combating trafficking and exploitation. His plans to study international relations and criminal justice reflected the global perspective that had emerged from his family's experience with transnational criminal organizations. The legacy of Elena's investigation had grown far beyond what anyone could have anticipated during those desperate weeks when Alex and Lily were fleeing through Oregon's mountains with evidence that seemed too dangerous to possess. The institutional changes, policy reforms, victim rescues, and criminal prosecutions that had resulted from Elena's work demonstrated how individual courage could create ripple effects that extended across continents and generations. Alex's final speech to the Academy's graduating class emphasized the collaborative nature of their success and the ongoing need for individuals willing to confront powerful enemies of justice and human dignity. She reminded the graduates that Elena's courage had made their work possible, but that their own dedication would determine whether her sacrifice continued, generating positive change for vulnerable populations around the world. The ceremony concluded with the traditional moment of silence for Elena and other fallen advocates, followed by the Academy's pledge to continue fighting trafficking and exploitation until every victim had been rescued and every perpetrator held accountable for their crimes. The graduates dispersed to their new assignments with the knowledge that they carried Elena's legacy forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.